On today's episode, I'd like to refer to something that I mentioned in the previous two episodes, meaning the ranking of sovereignty done by the Chinese vlogger Awakening Richard, the one that I recommended. So I've been thinking, what makes a country more sovereign or less sovereign? So, of course, there's one aspect whether or not you've been conquered by another country. So, Germany, Iraq, they fall pretty much into the last category because, well, not the last because they still have some agency, but category D because they've been military conquered, occupied, and the authorities of the country are literal emanations of the occupying power. So just like the German statehood was rewritten after 1945, there was a constitution drawn up by the American occupying forces in the West, in the west of the country. Similarly, in Iraq, the American occupation authorities basically chose the governing uh, governing parties all throughout today and made sure that the institutions of the country adhere to what the Americans want. But there is another tier. There's another reason for this lack of sovereignty in other countries which were less I don't know which were less sovereign than the aforementioned ones. So Germany and Iraq were conquered precisely because they were too sovereign. So Germany under the Austrian painter and Iraq under Saddam were conquered just because they were very, very, very sovereign. They were probably tier A sovereign countries or tier S. But there are these other types of countries like Romania, like Ukraine, like Kosovo, um, whose lack of autonomy stems from a different background. It's rather the lack of historical identity, the lack of any kind of historical depth. So we are recent countries. Um, we do not have such strong identity anchors as the other countries. So, for example, Poland, unless it is completely militarily occupied by the Americans and it has a puppet government run by the Americans, it cannot fall so low. It cannot fall into D category or F category. Okay, sure, the Polish elites see their future together with the American ones in having the same strategic objective, the defeat of Russia. Okay, but this is something that they do willingly. This is something that they do, okay, maybe not in a very rational manner, maybe it's not their best decision, but still it's something that they want. Whereas in the case of Romania, this is not really a question of whether or not we want it, because Romania doesn't have such a strong identity anchor in the past. The Romanians appeared in history in the 14th century. I mean, officially. Surely, biologically, they were there for some time, but like officially, politically, they appeared in the 14th century. And these polities, which were set up by the Kingdom of Hungary, and which subsequently became vassals of Poland, in the case of Moldova, and finally the Ottoman Empire for centuries in the case of both. And their identity, their cultural identity, stemmed not so much from the fact that they spoke Latin and they were a Romance population. This came later. This came in the 18th century in Transylvania, and in the 19th century in the Danubian principalities. It rather stemmed from the fact that they were Orthodox, that they were Christian Orthodox, and their language was their written language was Church Slavonic. They had the Slavonic liturgy and so on. So they were they saw themselves as part of the Slavic realm. And of course, once they realized that the West was okay, even though it was Catholic, so it had the opposite religion of theirs, but at the same time it was Latin, and they were Latin as well. And when they figured this out, and France was the cultural hegemon and so on, so they switched to another identity from this Slavonic identity to repudiating most of the Slavic words, bringing in imports from French, uh, devising the Latin alphabet, the Latin alphabet version of the Romanian language. So devising a Latin script to write Romanian, which had never been done in the past, and they basically chose the Western Latin, French, um, even to some extent Catholic um, identity from that point onwards. It's not like I'm not saying that they switched their religion to Catholicism, but if you look at the church paintings and the church architecture, it suddenly became like ever since 1870, 1880, it became hello. It became inspired from Catholic churches, from the academist church painting, and the facades were redrawn in neo-Baroque style. So if you look at churches from the 1870s, 1880s in Romania, they're all French inspired in their architecture and in their painting style. So yeah, you can imagine it's quite a long way from the Byzantine Orthodox icons to having religious paintings, just like in the Catholic churches, with no liturgical meaning, non-canonical, just depicting scenes of the lives of the saints and stuff like this, without um, any ritualistic function. So yeah, if the Romanians went so far in the 1870s, 1880s as to do that, then yeah, you can imagine how strong this desire was to leave in the past the cultural influences of the Orient, both the Ottoman ones and the Slavic ones, the Greco-Slavic ones. So yeah, my point is that the Romanian identity is quite fluctuating. So we were Slavonic to some extent, then we were French, and then we became, well, we had a short intermezzo in which we were completely enamored with the Axis powers. And I'm not talking just about the military alliances, I'm talking about where was the center of prestige, culturally speaking. So there was a brief period in which our official architecture, like in the late 30s and early 40s, it was drawn up in fascist Italian style. We were basically synchronizing with Nazi Germany, but with Mussolini as well in terms of aesthetics. And the regime, the strongman regime that Charles II inaugurated in 1938, royal dictatorship, was more inspired by Mussolini than by Hitler. But anyway. Um, So yeah, and then the center of prestige became Moscow for a brief while, and then we sought up these internal fountains of identity under Ceausescu. So after the Soviet army left Romania, and we became rather independent. And ever since 1990, our locus of prestige is the United States of America. So that's why Romania is not a country with very, very strong domestic identity fountains, identity sources, as opposed to Hungary or Serbia or even Bulgaria to some extent. So for us, once the United States became the locus of prestige, there were no real red lines that we could draw up in the sand to say, okay, we could cede our sovereignty up to here, but no more. Just like in the 1870s, we would pretty much do anything to become a province of France, and our leaders back then, the liberal leaders, Ice Brătianu, um, he wrote a letter to Napoleon III telling him that Romania would just be a French colony without bearing the costs of the occupying army, so we would just colonize ourselves willingly. something similar happened in relationship to the Americans, just because there was no stopping point. The stopping point would be some sort of identity that's derived from internal sources, some sort of prestige, national pride, and just because we do not have a very clear national identity. Of course, one could be drawn up, one that's also anchored in reality and that's also credible. So maybe it will not be so triumphant as the attempts were to craft up a national identity in the past 2 centuries. Maybe it would be a bit more complex and perhaps a bit contradictory at times, but it would be quite realistic, and I think it would be fascinating for people to see this synthesis, this Byzantine, Slavic, Roman synthesis, to take it as such, you know. But yeah, no real attempts have been made in this direction. During the reign of Ceausescu, this triumphalist version was exacerbated, and also with some obvious fakes um, regarding the ancient history of these places with the Dacians and everything. So yeah, until we craft up a national identity that's derived from internal sources of prestige, it's hard to claim any type of red lines and any type of I don't know, basic sovereignty that could never be ceded. You know, until then, the cessation of sovereignty is pretty much total, because there are no natural stopping points. There are at this point Romanians, unfortunately, that have absolutely no red lines when it comes to serving the hegemon, just because they see that as prestigious. I know the Americans, Israel, perhaps the European Union to some extent, Western European countries, but America and Israel for sure. So they just see that, they just have this natural tendency to serve a higher power, and they just see that as the natural hegemon, or the natural dominant power, and they have no red lines in terms of how to sacrifice themselves and their well-being on the altar of the interests of this power. So right now, for example, there are quite a lot of Romanians in this educated class, so in this class of people who have been successfully brainwashed by by the dominant culture and by the educational system, who see no red lines in terms of, for example, going to war for the interest of the hegemon, stuff like this. They would gladly bring Romania into war against Russia, even though that would be, of course, catastrophic for Romania. But they just see being Ukrainian as a superior version of being Romanian, and they see being American as the supreme version of being Romanian. They just see Romanian as being Romanian, the national identity, as some sort of empty vessel that should be filled in with the form, with the substance of a higher, superior political being, so to say. So for some it is the Americans, for others it is the Israelis. They just see themselves as empty vessels to be filled in by this higher power. So yeah, this is what I wanted to tell you. One country that goes away from this model and strikes me quite positively is Slovakia, because Slovakia also does not have much of a history. If you read the history of Slovakia or the history of Slovakians on Wikipedia, you'll be amused, because there's literally nothing. Okay, they were somehow a polity that was close to the Czechs in the early Middle Ages, and then in the later Middle Ages they were just incorporated by the Holy Roman Empire, and they did not have their own autonomy. No, sorry, by Hungary, and they did not have their own autonomy or something. They were just some scattered Slovaks here and there, and their capital was just the Hungarian capital. So Pozsony was the place where the Hungarian kings would get crowned, and their history starts after the First World War, essentially. But still, even though they do not have this locus of prestige, this internal locus of prestige that the Czechs have, with Bohemia in the Middle Ages, and so on. And of course, they do not have the same lot of prestige as the Hungarians have, with the Kingdom of Hungary, Saint Stefan, Matthias Corvinus, all those people. Still, right now, they are doing pretty well in terms of sovereignty. So they are opposed to their instrumentalization by the Americans, and their prime minister took a few bullets for that. So yeah, I don't know what the fountain of sovereignty is in the Slovak case. I think it's just the rejection of anti-communism, because in the Czech Republic they had a strong identity before, to which they could revert, but in Slovakia not so much. So they draw their source of national pride from the great Slovak uprising, the national uprising that they did against the Germans in 1944, and subsequently their alliance with the Russians, so to say. So they're becoming a Soviet state, the Soviet led communist state. So the Slovaks did not fully reject that communist identity. This is why the main party in power is that of Robert Fico, which is the former communist party. And yeah, Slovakia managed to avoid this trap, even though it doesn't have such powerful sources of national pride, domestic national identity. But in the case of Romania, unfortunately, we just go whenever we have a hegemon that dictates to us. We just have no limits. There are no red lines, there are no safe words, just like we went with Hitler all the way to the Volga in 1941, 1942, 1943. We will probably do the same with the Americans. There are no stopping points. So this is what I wanted to tell you today. Sorry for being a bit loud, for my surroundings being a bit loud and noisy. I'm in a park on a Saturday, so. But I hope I got my message across quite clearly. See you next time. Bye.